Hello everybody! Today we are talking about chapters 24 through 30 of The Order of the Phoenix. And there are so many interesting and interconnected plots going on in these chapters. We've got occlumency, mass escape from Azkaban, Quidditch, Firenze, career planning, Hagrid's brother in the woods, Harry's dreams, Valentine's Day, return of Rita Skeeter. It's just packed into these chapters. This video could be like 4 hours long. But I've decided to zoom out and spend some time talking about what it is that Umbridge is trying to accomplish at Hogwarts and whether she's succeeding, and also how that fits into the broader picture of magical society at this moment in time. So, let's start with Umbridge's initial goals. She is the senior undersecretary to the Minister of Magic, and we know that this is quite a high-ranking position. When Umbridge attends Harry's career counseling session with McGonagall, she accuses McGonagall of trying to install Dumbledore as the Minister of Magic, with McGonagall taking Umbridge's position. Since McGonagall is currently second in command at Hogwarts, this suggests that Umbridge's position in the Ministry may be second only to Fudge. So why is such an important person being deployed to Hogwarts for a whole year? What is she meant to accomplish? This is not just a keep an eye on Harry and Dumbledore kind of thing. Fudge would send someone much more junior to do that. So I see 4 main goals of installing Umbridge at Hogwarts at the beginning of the year. So first, she's there to reinforce the version of reality being put forward in the Daily Prophet. She must keep Harry and Dumbledore from convincing the student body, and by extension their parents, that Voldemort has returned, because that narrative would be destabilizing to Fudge's power. And Umbridge is initially fairly successful with this goal. Dumbledore isn't actively repeating his end-of-year speech from Goblet of Fire, and Harry's traumatic stress response ensures that even when he does insist that Voldemort's returned and murdered Cedric, he often does so in a way that reinforces the Daily Prophet's narrative that he's mentally unstable. However, this goal starts to fall apart when Hermione and Luna arrange for Rita Skeeter to write up Harry's story for the Quibbler, and Umbridge makes the tactical error of banning the magazine, ensuring that everyone at Hogwarts reads it. Umbridge's second goal is related. Since Fudge was unsuccessful in expelling Harry before the school year started, he wants Umbridge there to neutralize Harry's power by breaking him down mentally and possibly getting him to leave Hogwarts either voluntarily or through an expellable offense. At first glance, identifying this as one of Umbridge's goals seems overly Harry-centric. Maybe it only seems like Umbridge is out to get him because he's the narrator, and he's also traumatized. But the more I read this book, the more I think she really is out to get him. She doesn't just want to control Harry, she wants to break him. Umbridge certainly has sadistic qualities right across the board, but she deploys them in a targeted way, to take away from Harry everything he loves about Hogwarts, and everything that might help him cope with his trauma. Umbridge is someone who's deeply strategic. She spent her whole life in politics, cultivating a very particular public image and maneuvering her way all the way to the top, as has Fudge. So if Umbridge and Fudge are making these moves, there's a reason, and it's not just to be jerks to Harry. They want to push him to the point where he either A, has a complete mental breakdown, B, chooses to leave Hogwarts because it's no longer worth being there, or C, reacts to their abuse and gaslighting by breaking the rules so that they can expel him. Remember back to his disciplinary hearing, where Dumbledore reminded Fudge that he couldn't punish students for breaking rules at Hogwarts. But by making these new educational degrees straight from the Ministry, now they can expel him. And if we doubted that Harry's expulsion was an important goal, Fudge's presence in Dumbledore's office with a scribe and 2 aurors shows that it definitely is. This is the Minister of Magic. He should not have time in his busy schedule as the literal head of the government to show up at a school to watch a 15-year-old get in trouble for starting a club. And Umbridge and Fudge would have been successful in this goal if not for Dumbledore, which we'll circle back to. Okay, third goal. Keep the students from learning Defense Against the Dark Arts and mobilizing behind Dumbledore. This is the goal that the trio picks up on right from the start, and it's the reason why Umbridge's Defense Against the Dark Arts class is purely theoretical. Honestly, this goal strikes me as the least important, but I'm not surprised that our ever-self-confident trio doesn't see it that way. I find it hard to believe that the Ministry of Magic, with its hundreds of adult employees, many of whom have real-world fighting experience from the last war, is seriously afraid of Dumbledore's band of teen and preteen wizards, who've thus far had a pretty uneven education in defense against the dark arts. But if we accept this as one of Umbridge's goals, it is a total fail. Not only does her lack of teaching lead the students to form the DA, with Harry as their leader, but her position that the students don't need defense training because they have no one to defend themselves against becomes increasingly absurd as she herself becomes someone they have to defend themselves against. The fourth major goal I see of Umbridge's pre-headmistress agenda is to take control of Hogwarts' day-to-day operations. This is why Fudge makes her the High Inquisitor, and it's also why their educational decrees are, again, so incredibly micromanagey for these two extremely high-level people. So what is the function of this? Are they sincerely trying to improve Hogwarts? Is it just that Fudge has always resented Dumbledore's near-total control over this domain of the magical world? Again, I think this is targeted. Some of these decrees are aimed at Harry. They're petty things to control him and provoke him and make his life at Hogwarts worse. But more than this, seizing control of Hogwarts is aimed at Dumbledore. Specifically, I think they want to deprive Dumbledore of institutional power so as to weaken his influence, like they did by removing him from the Wizengamot. And, just like with Harry, they want to provoke Dumbledore into moving against Fudge or the Ministry in some way so that they can arrest him. With each new decree, they're daring Dumbledore to defy their authority and challenge them. For the most part, he will not take the bait, allowing Umbridge to ramp up her control over the school without objection. That we see, anyway. Harry's our narrator, and Dumbledore is actively avoiding him, so we don't know exactly how Dumbledore is taking this, but based on his resolutely cheerful demeanor at Harry's disciplinary hearing and the other professors' kind of grin and bear it approach to Umbridge, I think we can infer that Dumbledore has instructed his staff to just let Umbridge do her thing. He only steps in to protect Trelawney and Harry when they're in danger of being kicked out of Hogwarts, using technicalities to defend them until it becomes clear that he has to give Fudge either himself or Harry. And Dumbledore is the much bigger prize for Fudge, as we see when he expresses his glee that instead of expelling Harry, he gets to arrest Dumbledore. So in this way, Umbridge and Fudge succeed at this goal, though they don't actually get to arrest Dumbledore, they get him out. Though I don't think they actually intended to use Harry as bait. Fudge at least seems surprised by Dumbledore's move. And maybe this is why Umbridge's headmistress-ship unfolds so chaotically. I'm not sure that she and Fudge were fully prepared for her to assume total control of Hogwarts as headmistress, even though they wanted Dumbledore out. And I say this because their strategy at this point becomes much less clear and less effective. It's one thing to run a campaign to undermine and discredit the leader of a school, but once you seize control of an institution that remains mostly loyal to him, then what? Their position is all the more interesting because Fudge is already the head of the government and has been for at least the last several years. So we might expect Fudge and Umbridge to bring the running of Hogwarts into line with the way that Fudge runs the Ministry of Magic. So do they? My Potter Watch over the weekend was with my colleague from Political Science, Ellen Anderson, and her question was about what sort of government the Ministry of Magic is. She pointed out that the Minister of Magic, Fudge in this case, appears to have almost unlimited power. He seems to be the only minister, rather than the head of a group of ministers. There doesn't appear to be a legislative body, elected or otherwise. Instead, a massive group of bureaucrats under Fudge's control both write and operationalize the laws. The Aurors and Dementors, as the law enforcement, are also under his control, as is Azkaban. And while events such as the mass breakout of Death Eaters could potentially reflect badly on Fudge, he can also leverage them as opportunities for further crackdowns on civil liberties, as we saw in Prisoner of Azkaban with the Dementor patrols in Hogsmeade. As far as other democratic institutions go, the judiciary and the press may have previously been independent, but since the end of the Goblet of Fire, Fudge has brought both the Wizengamot and the Daily Prophet under his control, apparently meeting little resistance. And Hogwarts is evidently a state school whose previous independence from ministry control apparently relied on the minister's trust and respect for the headmaster, or at least his political calculations that interfering would be unpopular. And I would also add that whoever the Minister of Magic is, they also have at their disposal any number of powerful magical objects that their real-world counterparts don't have, which an unscrupulous leader could certainly use in all sorts of ways to retain power. In many ways, the structure of Hogwarts mirrors the Ministry. There's a headmaster or headmistress who has a huge amount of power, though there's a system of professors, heads of houses, head boys and girls, and prefects that mirrors the department-based hierarchical structure of the Ministry. Everybody knows that Dumbledore is ultimately in charge, and the professors defer to him even when they don't like or agree with his decisions. Dumbledore chooses to be fairly hands-off, handing over the everyday running of the school to the professors and to Filch, while he attends to other important Dumbledore business. In fact, we've suggested that he might be a little bit more hands-on, like making sure all the professors are competent teachers and not bullying the students. But the structure exists for a Hogwarts headmaster or headmistress to essentially become a dictator, just as the structure exists for a Minister of Magic to essentially become a dictator. So it's not surprising that Umbridge takes a much more authoritarian approach as Hogwarts headmistress at the same time that Fudge is consolidating power at the Ministry. We see her trying to tighten control over every aspect of the school, and when she meets resistance, resorting to more and more violent methods of keeping students in line, with the result that not only the students, but also the professors seem united in their hatred of her, with the notable exceptions of the Slytherins and Filch, who she recruits to assist her in her surveillance of and violence toward the student body. But this brings us to an important tension between Umbridge as head of Hogwarts and Fudge as head of the Ministry. The one thing we've seen most consistently from Fudge throughout the series is that he's obsessed with public opinion. And this is curious because we never see any evidence that the Minister of Magic is elected. There's nothing in these books about elections. But Fudge behaves like a politician who cares very much about whether he appears to be doing a good job. He's quite willing to make immoral and illogical choices in order to preserve the public's good opinion of him. Umbridge, at this stage in the book, does not appear to care whether students like her or think she's doing a good job. Though she started the school year assuring students that they would be very good friends, and she continues to wrap herself in a cloying, false sweetness, the gloves are off at this point. She's going to have Filch publicly whip the Weasley twins. And yet, Umbridge is still acting as a representative of the Ministry, and specifically of Fudge, who's so preoccupied with public approval. So it makes sense to wonder, as many of you have in your reading responses, what do the parents think about what Umbridge is doing? In these chapters, the only parents we see are the Slytherin Montague's parents. No one else's parents that we see come to Hogwarts or send howlers to Umbridge or pull their children out of school. So what do we make of that? One thought is that many parents may not know what's happening. Some students may be reluctant to tell their parents for all sorts of reasons. But even if a student wanted to tell their parents, a lot of the normal channels are cut off. We know that Umbridge is watching the Floo network, presumably not just for Sirius, but for any communication between students and their parents. She's also trying to control students' owl post, though I imagine that a determined student could find a way to send an owl from Hogsmeade or somewhere on the grounds outside of Umbridge's view. But this is also only a short-term strategy, given that students are going to go home for the summer and presumably tell their parents what's been going on at Hogwarts. So I'm wondering if it's part of a larger shift within the Ministry, and Fudge is preparing to rule not by popular mandate, but by force and fear. I think we see a little of this with Marietta and her decision to report on the DA. Clearly, Marietta's never been super excited to be part of the DA, and seems to have been there just because Cho is. And some readers have speculated that Marietta is in love with Cho, and that's why she'll come along to anything that Cho does, but then spend the whole time glaring at Harry. And that could also be a factor in her choosing to tell Umbridge about the DA. But the reason that we're given is that Marietta's mother works at the Ministry, and Marietta's involvement could put her mother's job at risk, and maybe more. Clearly, she's not the only member of the DA with a relative of the Ministry. Half the magical adults in the UK appear to work for the Ministry. And certainly the Weasley twins did not give their dad's job security the slightest thought when they were planning their dramatic exit from Hogwarts. But I don't think that means that Marietta is being paranoid. We've seen multiple DA members have relatives who caution them to keep clear of Harry or to stay on the right side of Umbridge. So it may be that some parents have a general sense of what's happening at Hogwarts, but see it less as an anomaly that a bit of well-publicized parental outrage can correct by leaning on Fudge's concern about public approval. They may see it more as part of a general slide toward authoritarianism that they can't fight openly without endangering their families. Remember, at this point, Fudge now controls almost every level of magical society. So all they can do is urge their own children to keep their heads down. And that, I think, is much darker than I'd initially realized. We already knew that this was basically Harry's situation, but it may already be the situation for all of magical society, whether the students at Hogwarts realize it or not. So that's all from me for now. I'm excited to hear what you have to say about these chapters.